alcohol and drug issues are first and foremost health issues, that we need a compassionate, proportionate and innovative response. So last time we talked about meth. Next month we're going to be talking about harm-reducing approaches to law enforcement. But today we're talking about harm reduction. What are the things that we can do for those people, to support those people who are using drugs to stay safe? So we're going to be talking a little bit about the needle exchange program, and we're going to be talking a little bit around how do we help people who are at festivals and clubs who are using this vast array of new substances that are out there. So New Zealand has kind of a proud history around harm reduction. We were one of the first countries in the world to have a nationwide government-funded needle exchange program in response to the HIV crisis in the late 80s. So our needle exchange program's been going for about 30 years, and as a result of a brave government, New Zealand has one of the lowest rates of HIV infections amongst people who inject drugs. But is that enough? Is provision of sterile injecting equipment in this day and age enough for people who inject drugs? So we're going to be hearing from Kathryn Leafe, who's the new Executive Director of the National Needle Exchange Program, to talk about the successes that we've had, but what's the future? What are the things that needle exchange are going to do in these changing times? Then the other thing we're going to talk about is this beast that we have, this rapidly changing drug market where new substances are being cooked up. We don't know what they are. People who are using these substances don't know what they are. They're often sold as something else. And is there something that we can do as a result of that changing market? And so we have our friend David Caldicott from Australia to talk about what can we do in those venues where people are going to be consuming all these new and unknown substances. And I'll introduce you when it's time. But I'd like to introduce Kathryn Leafe. Kathryn has been in the role as Executive Director of the Needle Exchange Services Trust. That's the national body for the Needle Exchange Program. It provides all of the support services to the exchanges and pharmacies around the country. But before that role, Kathryn led Care NZ, which is an NGO treatment provider that provides services across the country. Before that role, though, she's a West Coast person, West Coaster. Is there you called anything else?
Probably many things.
Yes.
West Coast, I'll do for now.
She's from the West Coast, and she provided, or she led a lot of the social service provision following the Pike River mine disaster. All of the things around mental health and social services following that. And she's worked extensively on contract to the United Nations. She's worked across the UK, running services based in London, and she's worked in Eastern Europe on harm reduction services. So she has a huge knowledge of all of the tricky things around needle exchanges and harm reduction and treatment and the intersection of all of those things. So I'd like to welcome my good friend Kathryn to the stage. Clip that onto your jacket.
How do we do that?
That's just for recording purposes.
Okay.
I'll take that off.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you very much, Ross, for that introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come and be here today and to join you all for this Speaker and Soup series and really important discussions around harm reduction. I'll try and kind of live up to the introduction that Ross just gave, but I mean, I started my career working in harm reduction services. I started my career, I mean, I don't think I ever at the time ever saw it as a career. It was something that I did and got involved in. But I was working in the 1990s in the UK and doing a lot of early prison drug work, working with prisoners who were injecting drug users, and HIV was at that particular time our concern. And in a relatively small period of time, we've come a long way. Just to put into context, I think, some of the work around harm reduction. At that time when I was working in the jails, it would be not a good idea for me to tell any of the prison staff that I was a drugs counsellor. I used to go under the guise of a health visitor, and you certainly didn't want to let people know kind of the real reason why you were there and what some of the context and work that you were actually doing. Fast forward now to 2016, 2017, and we actually have prison staff who are involved in drug service delivery. We have people from the police here today, so the world has actually changed quite significantly, but I think, as I'll touch on, we still have some very fundamental and very familiar challenges. So it is my great privilege actually to lead at this point the New Zealand Needle Exchange Programme. As Ross said, it is a little known fact sometimes. It is the first state-sponsored needle exchange programme in the world, and so hats off to all as Kiwis about that. As you'll tell from the accent, I didn't grow up here. I grew up in England, but my whānau is kind of West Coast, South Island, and I enjoyed, I'm pleased to say, a very smooth flight up this morning from Westport. So harm reduction, needle exchange is where to from here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about what we do in New Zealand, and also kind of possible signposting some future directions and some what I see as some key issues. As Ross alluded to, harm reduction's been around since the mid-late 80s. It really came out of a response to the HIV. And I really just want to, before I go any further, acknowledge colleagues in the room who've worked for a long time in needle exchange services, and also acknowledge the pioneers who led this early work. That's why we have such a low prevalence of HIV in our country amongst injecting drug users, and that's actually quite world leading, and many people look at us quite enviously. Hepatitis C, of course, is still a major challenge, as is overdose, and I left my pin at home. I was halfway on the way to Westport and realised I hadn't got it, but the little pins are really important next week, National Overdose Day, and to give a plug for the Wellington Needle Exchange Programme, there's a day of remembrance happening there in Willis Street. Please do go along. So to tell you a little bit about the Needle Exchange Programme in New Zealand, it operates nationally. Just about all the country is covered through needle exchange. There are some parts of the country where access is a little bit more difficult than others, but that's something we're working on. We've got 20 fixed site needle exchanges throughout the country, and there are 183 other alternative sites, either at pharmacies or partner organisations, where people can go and exchange needles. The New Zealand Needle Exchange Programme distributes somewhere in the region of 3 million needle and syringes each year. We do have a one-for-one programme, which is a free programme, whereby there is certain needles and syringes that can be exchanged by users on a returns basis, and we also make available for purchase other injecting equipment and supplies. Some of our needle exchanges have been delivering and leading work in hepatitis C clinics attached to the needle exchanges, and that's a piece of work which is going to be continued to be rolled out and developed as we move forwards. I think we've had very much a key message of the New Zealand Needle Exchange Programme is use a clean needle every time, and the latest study in 2013 evidenced that about 90% of injecting drug users report using a clean needle a new needle every time. But there are still 10% that aren't doing that, so that's an issue we need to look at. And also some of our research is suggesting also we may need to give some thought to other things than needles and syringes that people are using. So it's very, very clear that people have got the message about needles and syringes, but things like spoons, etc., are also part of the picture, and we need to do something about that. So harm reduction very much is the absolute opposite of the war on drugs. Harm reduction is about focusing on empathy and understanding. In fact, there's plenty of evidence that the war on drugs has created more harm than drugs itself. For me, harm reduction is about meeting people where they are at, however they see and however they understand their drug use. It's about being non-judgmental. And harm reduction services are quite broad. They're not just needle and syringe exchange. It shouldn't just be about that. It's about information, it's about advice, it's about support across a range of a drug use spectrum. So harm reduction services are relevant to people who socially use, recreationally use, heavily use, maybe have a chronic use, maybe a chaotic. So it should encompass that whole broad spectrum. I think one of the things that's really important in harm reduction is, and comes from that meeting people where they're at, is this non-judgmental attitude and the building of a relationship. Now, as Ross said, I've been privileged many times to work in lots of different parts of the treatment spectrum. Harm reduction is where I've spent most of my working life, and it's kind of where I feel really at home. But I think one of the things that we know is that pretty much AOD services, we're a revolving door. People come in and out, roundabout. And one of the things that's important that will keep people coming back if they need help or support is that relationship. So having a good relationship and a good experience when you go into a needle exchange may at some point in the future be a good foundation for some later assistance, because people will remember, actually, people treated me well when I was there. They understood where I was coming from. They didn't judge me. But we have a lot of challenges as well. I think one of the challenges generally around harm reduction at the moment internationally is that we're often funded through monies that come about addressing bloodborne viruses. So HIV has been a particular kind of driver for funding. But it's important, and there's a risk here that harm reduction just becomes seen as needle and syringe programs. Harm reduction is about, and should be about, so much more. I think we've always, those of us who've been around enough in the sector know that there's always been historically a bit of a tension, and I think if we're honest, that tension is still there between abstinence and harm reduction. And they're seen as being polar opposites, and never the twain shall meet. That's not something that I think personally is particularly helpful. I don't see them as alternatives. I think that they're actually part of the same thing and a broader continuum. I think one of the challenges for us is that recovery and abstinence is very easily understood politically and is also very easily understood by Joe Public. Harm reduction, in fact we were having a discussion before we came in, harm reduction often, so you condone people using drugs. Well, that's missing the point. And I think one of the things is that, I'm preaching to the converted here, no doubt, we all know that there are drugs, mood-altering substances throughout civilizations across the world, within countries. People have always used something. Some drugs happen to be legal and some happen to be illegal. That's not really what we're talking, so it's not about condoning drug use necessarily per se. It's about accepting people where they're at, what they're doing, and understanding that. I think there is a real challenge for those of us who are in the harm reduction sector at the moment around our visibility. There's a big drive towards recovery-led services and recovery strategies. And I guess the question that I just want to float is, so where does harm reduction fit within that broader recovery agenda? Is recovery really abstinence, or is recovery something else? And often you see on documents, a recovery strategy, open bracket, however the client defines it, close bracket. And I guess I kind of worry that, and however someone defines it, is quite small and gets forgotten about, and that the drive really is towards abstinence-based recovery. And I think that's just something as harm reduction people we need to be really, really familiar of. And I think we also need to remember that not everybody who needs harm reduction services will see themselves as having a problem. The reality is that lots of people use drugs regularly and don't encounter problems. And harm reduction is about that as well. So what should harm reduction look like? Harm reduction, as I've already touched on, it should include health services. It should include social policy work, education and support. It's really important that as harm reductionists we're actually involved in advocating around decriminalisation. The criminalising of certain activities and actions and drug-using utensils forms a barrier to help. And it can get in the way of people getting the harm reduction information and advice that they need and be a barrier to those services, and we need to address that. The support actually is quite broad-ranging. The support does need to look, and we're going to hear more from David about this, about drug checking. I was reading something only online just a couple of days ago about how in the UK ecstasy now is much, much stronger. People don't know what they're taking, the whole role of the dark web. We need to look at those things. Overdose. People do overdose and die from drug use in New Zealand. So yeah, we could take the moral high ground and say, don't use, but actually that's not reality. We need to be talking about drug consumption rooms. We need to be talking about safe injection facilities. These things are happening in many countries now internationally, and in New Zealand we need to be looking at it. There's been a lot, we're in Wellington, there's been a lot of conversation in Wellington over the years about a wet hostel, housing first. Again, harm reduction. Let's get people safe. Let's support them in what they're doing. We also need to look at providing advice and information. This is a piece of work we're starting to look at very much in the needle exchange. Some of the needle exchanges do a lot of this work, some do less. Needle exchange isn't just, in our view, about a straight one-for-one exchange of needle and syringes. It's an opportunity for us over time to build a relationship with people, to talk to them about, oh, notice that abscess on your arm, or what's happening with your veins. Build that conversation so that we can give them access to health services. Often people are afraid to go to their GP. They're afraid of legal consequences, so we can work with them around that. But also talk to them about other harm reduction programs such as OST and potentially other A&D services, because we do potentially form a pathway into other services, should that be what the individual actually wants. So in New Zealand, where are we actually at? We're having, as I say, quite a few conversations in the Needle Exchange program now about what else we can do. We've had a very successful model for the last 10, 15 years that we've been delivering, and in fact only last week was engaged in talking with the different regional managers from across the Needle Exchange program about what might be the next steps. What's some of the things that we, blue sky thinking, we think we should be able to do, and where can we move towards? And I think we see very much about increasing that advice, information and support, linking in with other services, expanding the range of harm reduction materials we can make available as critical things, as well as actually trying to remove geographic and economic barriers to accessing harm reduction information and supplies. So watch this space. I think there'll be quite a lot happening over the coming months in the Needle Exchange. There have been conversations in New Zealand and work done around drug checking. The National Drug Policy, as Ross said, does have three kind of key phrases which Peter Dunn, the Minister, talks about, which is compassion, innovation and proportion. And I think that gives us a real platform to look at what else we can do. Me being me is bound to mention criminal justice system. Those of you who know me know I've done quite a bit of work in criminal justice. And I think there is work we need to do within the corrections arena around harm reduction. We have naloxone. And we have exciting developments in relation, and I say exciting because we have an opportunity here around hepatitis C. We have the potential to eliminate the virus, but we need to probably upscale. We need to make sure that people get access to hep C testing and treatment. Needle exchanges are going to play a key role in that, and we need to be able to expand that provision for people. And we need to do some work around overdose. Too many New Zealanders die from drug-related overdoses. One is too many. Any deaths, and they are preventable. So information and advice and then naloxone developments are really, really welcome. So that's really just a brief kind of overview of harm reduction here in New Zealand and some of the next directions that we'll be going in. Thank you.
Questions?
Yep.
This guy talks. I can shut him up. Thanks so much, Kathryn. We'll hold questions to the end. We'll have enough time for a good discussion around, what's the future going to look like. And it's now my pleasure to invite David Caldicott. He's from Canberra, but he's got an odd accent. I don't think it's Australian. So David probably will tell you, he's a medical doctor, so he's bound to tell you more about himself. But he's an emergency doctor in Canberra, but he's got a long history, not just in Australia, but in the UK, working with people who use drugs. Not just the ones that show up in hospital in an ambulance, but people on different venues, where they might consume drugs. In Australia, he's a bit of a loud voice for doing new and different things in this space, and is often, I think, challenged by quite a conservative political environment over there. So he's the guy that's been talking about drug checking, pill checking at festivals. He's talking about drug law reform. He tries to engage with politicians and police and others on these issues. I've known David for a few years now, and he's a guy that has a lot of impact in Australia, and I thought, well, we need to get him over here to see if he can help us have some impact. So we had him in New Zealand, in Wellington, for the last couple of days. And we started off with a meeting with sort of a Chatham House rule meeting, so I'm not going to tell you too much about it, but with some people exploring, could we pilot some of these festival services, harm reduction services at festivals in the summer that's just about to come. If you look at what happened in Australian summer last year, they had 5 deaths at festivals where people died from drugs, whether they knew what the drugs were and they took too much, or they thought the drug was something else and they took that. So we thought, well, shit, we don't want that to happen in New Zealand, so we should be doing something in this space. So we've explored some things around festivals. We then took him to Parliament to meet politicians, and I have to say we had a session with politicians from most of the political parties all together, and the kind of stuff that David was talking about wasn't heretical. They weren't gobsmacked by what he was saying. It was like, well, that sounds good. How can we get that going? The mood in the room was a real positive mood. And then yesterday afternoon we met with police and health officials on these topics as well, and those officials who are wonderful people, like, yeah, this is a no-brainer. We'll get this done. We just need to look at what are some of the legal issues around this, but we'll do it. And so it's going to be quite exciting working with politicians and with policymakers around what we can do. And so David's going to come up now and describe this thing. I think he's going to talk about the fact that this isn't a new thing, that this isn't something that's just popped up in Europe in the last couple of years. This is a harm reduction services that's been going for a long time with some great results. And so, sir, over to you.
Thank you very much. Are you going to sort out my tech, are you?
Yeah, I'm going to let David's come in and Stephen's going to do your...
Oh, cracking. Soup. There you go. How are you all? How you doing? Dia Richa Corja, and I'll try it. Kia ora. How's that? Was all right? Yeah? Yes. Thank you. I feel obliged to greet you both in my language and in yours, because, in fact, we're very similar, actually. We're both small islands. Our bigger neighbours are wealthier and dumber. We play rugby for the purposes of beating them, and your weather is entirely similar. I'm absolutely. What's this? Let me get. You're waving at me there now. Are you happy? Very good. Oh, you want to enable that content so I can take over the entire Drug Foundation. That's right. And I am delighted to be here, both as a guest of the New Zealand Drug Foundation, who I am frankly in awe of. If I could clone this ugly little man in the front, I would, and take him back and have one in Australia. I'm also in awe of your national drugs policy. I know, I've heard again and again, isn't it shocking how slow everything is going in New Zealand? If only you knew how progressive you are compared to everybody else. You are the flag bearers for us when we're trying to change things elsewhere. And it's actually become my fervent hope to see whether or not we can get drug checking up and running in New Zealand before we do in Australia. Because the response that we've had, the positive response that we've had from both law enforcement, from policy folk, and from politicians even, has been something, frankly, I'm unfamiliar with. Right, grand, I think we're going. So how do you want me to make it go?
Just click the button.
Right. You'll know that I'm technically not very gifted here. but your life would be safe in my hands should it be needed. So this is a little group that I'm an emergency doctor, so by nature, a pretty primitive person. What I do to people is usually horrible, but life-saving and necessary. And I'm not particularly sophisticated, and therefore my approaches to things like drugs are pretty pragmatic. It's got to work. I don't really care what the message is, what the politics is. If it doesn't have an outcome and it doesn't work, I'm not really that interested because I'm too dumb to understand the reasoning behind it. And this is my little research group. It's brand new. You'll be seeing more of this. It's independent, which is a big deal. It's based at the Australian National University, and it brings together a couple of threads of some really good research that happens there. So the Australian Drug Observatory. I didn't do that logo. I love that logo. You see, there's party people in the people's eyes, and we're watching things. That's how it works. So now let's see if I can make this thing go. Maybe if I do that. Yeah. So I thought what maybe we could talk about today is pill testing at music festivals, and my supposition is that this is going to generate all of us, everyone, drugs workers, health folk, law enforcement, politicians, policy designers, data that they just don't have access to just yet, and they need access to it. I don't know, you have hip-hop in this country, don't you? Yeah. So in Australia, there are some very good things about Australia, mostly nothing to do with politics, but the music isn't bad. This is a hip-hop group called the Hilltop Hoods from my old hometown, Adelaide. And this is an album called The Hard Road. And God damn it, this has been a hard road for us. I've been involved in the politics and policy of pill testing in Australia, both in my first iteration in Australia, which was from 99 onwards, and then again since I've come back from 2009. And I don't know if you know the mythology of Cassandra. Cassandra was cursed by the gods to be able to tell the future, but that nobody would believe her. And that's exactly the curse that I have. I told you that this was going to be necessary. I told you 10 years ago, and nobody paid attention to me. And now I can say na 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 in your face. This really started for me in 2001, when I was a much more junior doctor, and I was treating an overdose. Ostensibly, this was in the middle of the first phase of methamphetamine in Australia. It's like skateboards. They were always there before, and then they came back again. And I treated a young man called Alan in his 20s, and he died. Now, that is a big deal for an emergency doctor, because people in their 20s aren't supposed to die. Nobody's supposed to die in those circumstances. And he died in a very different way to the sort of stuff that we were seeing, this methamphetamine lark, and we needed to look into this. And it turned out that he died from something called PMA, or paramethoxyamphetamine. This is one of those few drugs that'll just kill you. We did a research project on it. We get all of this data that says there might be an association with this death. We don't know whether it was causal or whatever. PMA kills people, period. About 10% of people who present to hospital with PMA overdose end up in the intensive care unit. We published this data. And this is actually probably the largest series on PMA overdoses published anyway. This is the only time I ever had occasion to speak to Alexander Shulgin, the guy who is like the godfather of MDMA. And his commentary was, what the hell are you guys doing in Australia? Why are you using PMA? He described this in his book as something that you shouldn't use. Why the hell are you using it? But that was the market then. And since then, it's got worse. So I guess part of a crusade is pathetic, but it's a very Irish thing to do. We decided we'd go and look and see, what can we do about this? So it became obvious that if you took PMA, you're likely to get badly hurt. So the obvious conclusion was you stop people taking PMA. So how do you do that? And so I looked around, and of course, the very little published information, but there was quite a lot of grey literature out there. There was a bunch of useful knowledge. And we found very early on, back in 2001 when we were looking around, the Europeans had started something called pill testing. This was studied. It was funded by the European Union. They had done these evaluations, huge evaluations, with thousands of festival goers across capital cities. And I guess part of the problem is because in medicine, and probably in science and social sciences literature, if it's not written in English, it doesn't exist. But where a lot of this stuff was being done, it was just written in the native language. This is an awesome paper from Gregor Burkhardt and Harold Kreiner, both of whom don't actually speak Spanish, but this was published in Spanish because that's where the research was published. It's an awesome paper. I've got a translation of it if you want to read it, which talks about the pros and cons, but as long ago as 2003. So you've heard of this term pill testing. It's transmogrified now into this term drug checking. And it's funny because what is being done is no different to what was being done in the pill testing era. There's a supposition among the people who are actually doing the pill testing that in fact it is the academic community that's trying to think up a new name to A, increase its respectability, and B, be the first people involved in it. But there's nothing new here. It's all about grants and publications. So that's the new term that people, I have to say I still use pill testing because it's roughly the same thing. And just to go through, I mean, what we're talking about, what could be done, what are the sort of options really, is that we know that law enforcement, and you've either mugged and stolen a police officer's jacket, sir, or you are in law enforcement, you will be able to vouch for the fact that you can probably test whatever you want, wherever you want. That's what law enforcement can do. And that's useful, and it's right, and it's proper. So you can see that, in the vast majority of times, I put it to you that the people who are having their pill tested when they're in contact with law enforcement probably are reluctant to have their pills tested. So it's involuntary, but it can happen anywhere. What we currently do, and I think is of interest in your early warning systems that you're developing in New Zealand, in the ACT, if you rock up to my emergency department and you have in your possession something that has made you unwell, you have two options. You can either give it to the nice man in the back row with the jacket, or you can give it to me. And I'm sorry to say, I get it all. I can't understand it, but they always choose to give it to me. And I will contact them with the results of what has made them unwell. I will catch and release them into the wild to spread the information about how dangerous their drug use has become. And it's a sort of a viral marketing technique. And what we're talking about and what I want to do is sort of go looking for the enemy where it is to be found. If I want to research Ebola, I'm not going to go to Dunedin. I'm going to go to Sierra Leone. If I want to research drugs at the point of consumption, I'm going to go to a music festival. Once again, emergency doctor, not rocket science. There's also a sort of a variation in the tech that we can use. So varying obviously from low tech to higher tech. Now, traditionally you've probably associated the concept, those of you who've heard of this before, of pill testing with those lovely little reagent tests, the colourful things that change colours, you know, depending upon what you put in them. And I would put it to you about 10, 15 years ago, the paper that we published on this actually used them. We compared it to the laboratory testing and it didn't quite match up then. But it was probably fit for purpose a decade or decade and a half ago. But then we were only really worried about maybe 10 to 20 different drugs. And that market has changed fundamentally. So as far as the colorimetric testing is concerned, the reagent testing, the marquees, the mandolins, all of these sort of Victorian presumptive tests, there is a role for them in screening. But in working out in what is in an extraordinary market, we need to do better. And so we bring the mountain to Muhammad. We bring the kit to the music festival. I can even have it solar powered at the music. We'll be carbon neutral. But the very things that your law enforcement is using in laboratories to prosecute cases, we can use to save lives at music festivals. And that includes things like GCMS, like HPLC. We won't bring an NMR machine to I think that whoever brings an NMR machine to a music festival first will be a genius. We're not ready for that just yet, but we do have an NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance machine, the ultimate arbiter, the analytical god of machines. We have one at our disposal. And put it in context, we need to have one at our disposal because many of the products that we're seeing have never been seen before. There are no fingerprints for these entities anywhere. We need to break the molecule and build it to find out what it is. That's the market we're dealing with. So in terms of the tech, you can really, if what I want to bring to a festival, it's got to be reliable, it's got to be fast, it's got to be transportable. And that kind of, slots things into different places. The reagent testing is fast and transportable, no doubt. Cheap as well, but not really that reliable. GCMS, really reliable, a little bit slow. NMR, very reliable, very fast, can't move it. This is like in a truck. So there are pros and cons to the various parts of tech that are out there. I'm very fortunate. You've seen, or those of you who are early would have seen my inability to load my talk on this machine. I don't have to think about these things because I've got the Research School of Chemistry at the Australian National University on side. They do the clever thinking. They pick the machine for me, and depending on the circumstances, we bring the right machine to the right venue. I guess there's also this sort of range of moral. People talk about, well, you might be able to do it, but is it right? That's something that I suppose you have to address. So, in that scale of things, you've got law enforcement who really are, in fact, the opposite of peer testing. The peer testing, like the consumer actually testing their own drugs to make sure that it's safe for them, that's the devil. Whereas, of course, law enforcement, they're on the side of the angels. I myself am somewhere in between. I will always be Batman. And so what we started to do back in the early 2000s was to go to music festivals. I would love to say this was my idea. I'm a bloody genius. I'm not. I'm an emergency doctor. I can change a tire. That's about right. That's what I can do. It was somebody else's idea. We just stole their methodology. And so between festival organizers, harm reduction agents, and a group of doctors who were motivated, we started testing pills in South Australia at a group of music festivals, or raves as they were called Enchanted. And so during that period of 5 years, we collected data from over 13,000 attendees, 13 events, 5,000 interviews, and in fact brought 2 politicians along to a music festival so that they could see that it wasn't all about guns and prostitution. The likeliest thing that was going to happen to any politician who came would be that they would either be licked or hugged. And that's what music festivals are mostly like, unless there's drum and bass, which is the work of the devil. We published this. This is a matter of record. It is everywhere for everyone to read. We published it in such a way that the consumer can read it. We removed the science as much as we could for the purposes of publication. And so I've talked about the importance of identifying products, but that actually is just the icing. What we also know, because we're just replicating what everybody else has found elsewhere, is that when you are on site providing a drug checking environment, over 2/3 of consumers, when they find out that their drugs contain something other than what they were expecting, they do something other than take their drugs. This is the only intervention that has been demonstrated to change people's behavior at the point of consumption. This replicates the findings in Canada. It replicates the findings in Europe. It replicates the findings anywhere where this question has been asked. And that, I think, is where the money is. People, obviously, our friends in law enforcement and drugs intelligence are fascinated with the novel products. I have to say, I kind of am as well. But this, from a community perspective, is probably where the money shot is. And this perpetuates over time. When you are conducting this work with the same group, there is a cultural memory. People modify how they choose to consume their drugs. There is less poly-drug abuse, and there are fewer pills taken. I'm not promising you, I'm not God, I can't stop people using drugs, but I can definitely change how they use drugs. So why bother? We're reaching parts that other interventions can't reach. It's pertinent to those people already consuming drugs. We are providing a currency for people who really are uncontactable. This is something that they want and we can give them. And in exchange, they will give us information about themselves that no one else has access to, both in the identity of the drugs and in the responses to the surveys that are conducted when the testing is occurring. We know that it alters people's behavior, and it serves not as a unique, but as a part of an early warning system right at the spiky end of the early warning system. So an early warning system is much broader than this, but this is right at the point of consumption. And if you're truly thinking of developing an early warning system in New Zealand, you really got to include something like this. This is my fear. This is what is going on in Europe. We live in a global economy. The music is global. The drugs are global. A trans-Pacific partnership will only facilitate the transport of drugs from another venue. They'll be in washing machines that are coming from around the world. And so we will see this. This is inevitable. To flip the seasons, summer is coming. And you need to be aware that this is on your doorstep. High purity MDMA and also the fentanyl analogs. That is in your future, I promise you. And it makes me nervous. So where do we traditionally get our data? Surveys and interviews, Mikey likey, kind of nice, that's lovely. People haven't a clue what they're taking, so that's, yeah, it's about behavior more than it is about content. Police seizures, it's kind of like going to Costco to see what's in people's cupboards. You're getting the wholesale market, but you're not really getting the granularity of what people are consuming. And custom seizures are more or less the same. Wastewater analysis, that's, look, you know, people argue about it. I think some people think it's the savior of everything. I discovered, interestingly, as an aside, I can isolate the wastewater out of the Houses of Parliament in Canberra. I'm sure you could in Wellington as well. That would make for an excellent study, I'm sure. But none of these things actually tell us what is going into people's mouths. And that's what I want to know, because that's what's making them come to my emergency department. Drug checking can. So we've seen a little bit in the literature up until last year, and now we've seen a massive flurry. All of these are new products that have been identified through drug checking in Europe, everywhere, all over Europe. In fact, in our own work, and this is the group that does it, TEDI, the Trans-European Drug Information Network, and this is they kind of really were too busy doing the testing rather to write up any of the papers, but we've impressed upon them the importance of publishing their data. And so over 5 years, they've analysed over 45,000 samples. This is 45,000 pieces of data in addition to the backlog that exists within the forensic system. Not only in Europe, I know it exists here and I know it exists in Australia, for free. This is information for free. It's sweeties. It changes individual behaviour. It can change behaviour at a population level, not only at the music festivals, but at a broader population as well. It definitely changes the market. When it was introduced first in Holland, what it did was it almost obliterated the contaminated market, because people knew that they could have their drug checked and that there are consequences for people selling drugs if they were selling tainted drugs. We can say to somebody, Ross, I've told you once, I've told you a million times, you should not be using methoxetamine. Seriously, you're wondering why you keep having to nip out and go to the loo. You've got a hemorrhagic cystitis, and that's because of your choice of your drug, which is individual to you. That is very powerful. It's not some sort of generic, do you know what, you're naughty, you shouldn't use drugs because you're going to hell. We are giving you a specific individual health message tailored to your drugs use at that moment. There's nothing else that does that. You're obviously going to get clinical data on how these novel drugs are having an effect on individuals, and it creates the early warning data stream. I admire you for your attempts at trying to keep up with my slide changes, ma'am. If you want a copy of this, you can. Yeah, that's fine. Sit back, relax, you'll be grand. There are multiple evaluations of this. This has been done. People have looked at it. It works. It's great. It's lovely. And a decade ago, 2015, November 2015, marked my decade anniversary of the Australian Medical Association calling for a trial of this in Australia. In fact, now, we don't have any opponents. We have a couple of crazy people, and that's fine. They're okay. They're people who have sustained some sort of injury through life, or nature has not been kind to them, and they oppose me. And we are generous with their opposition. It offers me the opportunity to discuss this issue with them widely. But in terms of credible scientists and doctors, we don't have anybody who's opposed to this anymore. And in fact, this was from a meeting last year, the Australian Drug Summit, where everybody worth their salt in Australia to do with drugs and alcohol got together, and they invited some fat Irish guy as well. But their conclusion was, in fact, that this should be introduced as a matter of priority. So the reality is that, the only thing that's missing, really, is the moxie to do this. And that's moxie that you guys have. The evidence is there. You can have all the evidence. All you need to do is make the decision to do it. And you will do a bit of a Bledisloe on the drugs policy arena yet again. Why not do it? So most of the time when people tell me not to do this, they quote this paper from Adam Winstock, who you might know from the Global Drug Survey. He's since recanted. He's mortified at the fact that he's associated with this. And John Ramsey, who runs Tic Tac, a big database, which commercially, you could argue there's a conflict of interest between people finding out their own drug content versus a commercial entity. I wouldn't say that. And also Kim Wolf, who everybody forgets, but actually is very important. She's been very important in the whole drug driving legislation in UK recently. But I put a picture up there because people forget how important she is. People say that it's illegal, that it encourages drug use, that it's not accurate, and that it sends the wrong message. All of these are incorrect. So I think you guys probably have equivalent law. So I'll go through the sort of reasoning that we've had. We've had multiple legal opinions, and I'm very convinced that I can't be arrested for doing this. So this probably looks familiar to you, and there are equivalents. This is for New South Wales, which is one of the states in Australia. But, interestingly, the New South Wales police system actually provided this confidential, I shouldn't really be showing you, I may have to kill you all, this information to the Commonwealth Department of Health as far ago as 2001, their legal assessment of what pill testing means. We wouldn't be really committing an offence because, of course, to be committing an offence, we'd have to be knowingly in possession of something that was known to be illegal. I haven't a clue what I'm testing until I have the result. The result of what I'm testing is destroyed by the testing. So I am never knowingly in possession of something that is illegal. The length of time in which it takes to do the test probably legally does not constitute a length of time that can be considered as possession. See, these all represent stumbling blocks. Each one is a stumbling block. Together, it makes it very difficult to prosecute. If I am aiding or abetting or supplying drugs, then definitely I should be pinged. But I'm actually trying to persuade people not to use drugs. So I'm not in breach in that way. And I should be linked in purpose if I'm going to be successfully prosecuted. So I should be there for the purposes of facilitating drug use. So all in all, I would say, with great respect to my friends in law enforcement, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. I have 3 daughters who need frocks, and you'll be paying for them forever. Now that does not stop consumers, of course, being liable to arrest. And that is where we need our friends in law enforcement. We need law enforcement to allow consumers to be able to have their drugs tested. It's not accurate. Well, with my due respect to my friends from the festival environment, I think the easy tests are probably not accurate. I think that's fair to say. But that's a deliberate furphy put out by largely our politicians because they ignore the fact that we're not talking about our reagent tests. We're talking about really expensive gear in comparison to reagent testing. So HPLC, TLC, GCMS. And this is what Fiona Measham has been using. She used this last month, in fact, in UK for the first time with the collaboration and cooperation of law enforcement in Cambridgeshire. She used the Brooker Alpha FTIR, which is so much cheaper and more sensitive than this poor chap who can't possibly keep up with the market as it evolves. We've had the next round of opposition. We can't tell the purity. Yes, we can. You can't tell other substances. Yes, we can. We can't tell how individuals respond. That is correct. That is correct. But that is part of the warning that we give them. Even if we find something that doesn't appear to be noxious on first glance, our warning to them. We don't know how this is going to affect you, old chap. We don't know about you medically. Our advice is that if you want to be 100% safe from drug problems and drug accidents, you don't use drugs. So we are never telling people drugs are good or drugs are safe. And testing one pill won't give any information on one that looks the same. Well, no shit, Sherlock. Yeah, everybody knows that. And the only reason you're raising that is because you don't know the music scene. So we've had a couple of hybrid models. I set up a group in South Australia. It was the methodology called RABBIT. You'll see I've got a thing for acronyms, the Royal Adelaide Hospital-based Illicit Testing Programme. Never got off the ground for political reasons. We took that methodology and just dumped it into ACTINOS. That's the methodology of ACTINOS, where you can, on the street, pick up a drug, send it into ACTINOS, it'll be analysed, and the results will be posted online. Funded now to £7.2 million over 5 years. And ACTINOS, so in the ACT, as I said, if you turn up with a drug, we'll analyse it. We've found some really interesting stuff. We were the first people to really identify mephedrone in Australia back in the day, using the emergency department as a sort of a sentinel monitoring place, and also the first people to identify methoxetamine, which is probably well established in New Zealand by now, is it? You guys have it? It's an aryl cyclohexamine, a ketamine analogue. It's probably around. And in the meantime, the Europeans has just rocked on. The Europeans are collecting all this data, analysing, sharing with the EMCDA, sharing with policy folk. The attempts to get it off the ground have been successful in the UK. It's now established. And there is now a discussion between the people, Fiona Measham, the researcher, and the Lord Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, about introducing it in the entirety of London. This is so dull. This is so dull. There's actually best practice guidelines. As soon as anybody says best practice guidelines to me, I've missed the boat. This is boring, and it is mundane. There's nothing risky or exciting about this at all. And in Oz, well, in Oz, it's, you know, you guys probably look at Oz and think of it a little like Alabama, and you're not too far removed from that. We've discovered some really interesting stuff out of ACTINOS. We know that there is really interesting stuff out there. On the left, there is a pill, mind you, not a blotter, a pill that contains 2 types of N-bone, which I know we were in Parliament when they were talking about that yesterday. That doesn't usually present that way. That's usually in a blotter. And the person, God bless him, the person who took it was somebody who had read a bit about harm reduction and decided to take a quarter of the pill to see what happened. Presented to my emergency department in atrial fibrillation. I don't know what would have happened to him if he'd taken the whole thing. And even more exciting, you're probably well aware of ketamine and methoxetamine. But this guy down here, you don't know. Nobody knows. It's deschloroketamine. You just take it off the chloride group and you turn a very useful medicinal drug, rather unexplainable recreational drug, into an 8-hour dissociative anesthetic. That's bad news for the drug environment. And we analyze that by pinging it off a patient. So back in April, I think 2015, a lot of researchers went from Australia to Club Health. It's a good conference if you get the chance. It's in Dublin next year, yeah. And came back, dilated pupils and starry-eyed, talking about this new thing called drug checking. We must do it. And we're like, oh, Jesus. Yeah, no, good idea, your idea, brilliant idea. And so we've had a resurgence of interest in this. And this is kind of what you need. You need knowledgeable volunteers. We're very lucky. You've heard of the Zendo project in the US? So these are people who work with people who are intoxicated and having maybe psychic or psychological problems. We've got the Australian equivalent called DanceSafe, and they're awesome. And technical support, we got that with the School of Chemistry. Off-site backup, which is at the ANU. Medical folk. Medical folk are useful when people fall over, and also medical folk are useful to reiterate that this is about health. This is not about facilitating drug use. This is a health thing. We're trying to prevent harm. Ethics isn't a problem. The ethicists, it's actually, and I'll show you, I think it's unethical not to do it. Law enforcement support. We're getting there. Having chatted to law enforcement yesterday, I think your law enforcement is probably more sensible than our law enforcement. You guys seem to be, I don't know, devoted to stopping young people dying. Seems sensible. Rather than sending some vague, opaque message about how evil you are. And of course, political bravery. Bravery is important. If you spent your entire political career pitching a message of abstinence, of prohibition, it's going to be hard for you. The reality is you're going to have to get out of that space at some time because the world's changing and you're just outdated dinosaurs dying. So the Australian Drugs Observatory is who we are and what we're up to. We're raising funds independently. That's our little website. And you're going to see a bit of this over the next summer because we're ready to go. This is going to be loud and noisy in Australia this summer. Similar to what my friend does in New Zealand. It's the only way to get people's attention. You can appeal to the better nature of our political friends. And I think sometimes that works. And if not, you need to explain to them how not acting in your interest of your patients is going to hurt them and how acting in their interest is going to help them. Because that's really the way you get to the corridors of power. So, yeah, we think we're pretty smart in Canberra. And this is coming. This is coming. I can see it. Like there's a 2,000-meter line of sight, and it is in my crosshairs. These drugs are coming. I'm telling you now. And if you don't do anything about it, you are culpable. It's on you. So get on with it. Show us lot how dumb we've been in Australia. Just get on with it. It benefits everybody. It's cheaper than everything. It's ridiculous not to do. And put it to you. With the evidence as it exists, don't be talking to me about whether it's ethical to do. Is it actually ethical not to provide this service if it stops even one person from dying? The last person who died in Australia was a bloody pharmacist. And if we can't get a message through to them, we are using the wrong messages. So this is my year 2 medicine ethics group. We discussed this as far as ethics is concerned. And put it to a vote. This is the future. This is what's coming. You decide whether you want to reap the glory now or look like idiots of the future. But the doctors coming through now universally support this. The people coming through, people in college, people in university, support this. And your legacy will be mocked as politicians unless you embrace this, even more so than it's destined to be already. So, that's my lot. I would be delighted to collaborate with you guys and facilitate. I am not aligned to anything other to a philosophy and a way of thinking. So if you guys set this up faster than the Big Island, it'll make me proud. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We have time for questions. I'm going to turn this into a dodgy fucking microphone.
MacGyver.
I don't know what I'm doing to it. Thank you, David. We've got time for some questions, and also once we've finished here formally, we'll have the folks will stick around and available for questions before David catches the plane out of here. So any questions to Kathryn or David? Sir.
John Ancorn, amongst other hats I'm wearing is I volunteer with Drug Arms, possibly known in Wellington, which is providing information and offering some food to people on the streets. A lot of the people who approach us are looking for this type of information, and I'm just wondering how available is it, because I'm aware that some of the information that we're handing out is a bit dated. Because, as I said, people are coming asking us about the difficult questions about newer drugs that they're using, and your presentation has shown how ignorant I am in being able to meet their needs. So I'm just wondering, where is the information and how can we access it to get the message out to people on the street who may approach us?
Well, I'm sure. Do you want me to use this thing?
Yeah.
So the question was, this fine gentleman looks after, is it homeless people and people on the street? Yeah. Who are asking questions about substances which, to be fair, even drug geeks like myself are only passingly familiar with. And how do we keep abreast with this information? And I think that's a great question. I'd answered the second part, or the thing that I think that we might be able to help with. Maybe Ross would be able to know where resources would be available in New Zealand. But it hadn't occurred to me, but I think just from listening to your question, that strikes me as an amazing place to have some early warning system monitoring going on. I can't believe this. I told you I was stupid, but it hadn't occurred to me that sort of environment would be interested in this sort of information. And that seems obvious. Now, I know that some of the dance-related organizations have really up-to-date good information, flyers and things like that. I don't know if that's of any use to your constituency. I'm sure that the Drug Foundation has got a ton of information, but and people would be delighted. It's such a worthy sort of environment. People would be delighted to divert something your way.
Thanks, David. David.
Hey.
Yes, a number of us here who are really interested in starting a drug early warning system. And one of the things that you talked about was the ability to detect, one of the issues, I guess, that we're grappling with is how do you detect something that you don't know anything about.
Oh, yeah.
And if you can, because you do talk about some of the systems you have in ACT, how much is it going to cost us? So that's yeah.
So this is one of the great thorny issues in this. So if I give you an analogy, this is the equivalent of, I don't know what your criminal record is, it's probably all right. This is the equivalent of Ross going into a house of someone that he doesn't know, killing them, leaving his fingerprints and leaving the premises. You have a set of fingerprints, but because there's no previous record of a previous crime, you've got a trace of something, but you don't know what it refers to. And that's exactly what's going on with this market. So this is one of the reasons why we are really keen to get native product. So the question really is if any of you want to pee in a pot for me, I can analyze it for, you know, some of the classics, the golden oldies, cannabis, the sort of things that workplace drug testing are so excited about. And one of the things that drives people into the novel market is that a lot of these things, you don't know what you're looking for. So the detection in biological matrix is difficult. And that's why we focus, generally speaking, on trying to get product itself. Because not only then can we identify what the mother product is, we can make some pretty clever inferences about how it's metabolized and what metabolites we should be looking for. You can run columns and look for bands which may or may not show. That's expensive to do that. It's actually a lot cheaper to analyze product. There are a lot more useful ways of analyzing product cheaply than there are for analyzing biological matrix. Blood, serum, urine, you got bits in there you don't want to know about, and the bits that clog up. It's a difficult process. It's much easier just to have a chunk of whatever it is you're interested in and look at that. So that's, I would say, by all means, try to develop ways of identifying novel products in urine and in serum. But if you can start with the collection, amnesty bins in emergency departments, you will get a bunch of really interesting data real fast.
Kind of a question for both around, so Kathryn, the needle exchange, 30 years old, and that was, the political environment was different, and New Zealand government acted pretty quickly to address what they knew was a crisis that they'd witnessed around the world. David, you've talked about the political environment in Australia. I know you had the picture of all the nice people that went to the summit, but you're facing problems, or New South Wales are facing problems with quite a belligerent government there. What's your sense of the politics? Probably Kathryn first. You presented some future thinking around needle exchange, drug consumption rooms, supervised injecting rooms. What's your sense of the political environment, and why do you think, David, the political environment's tricky where you are?
I think in terms of the political environment here in New Zealand, well, I think one of the things to say is that internationally, everything's changed. I think we're seeing things now that even 4 or 5 years ago we didn't think would actually happen. So whether or not we're talking about Portugal or legalisation of marijuana sale, I mean, things have changed, and there is, I think, a momentum for change. In New Zealand, I think we have a very progressive drug strategy policy. But of course, we've also had our own challenges recently with the new psychoactive substances legislation. So I think we need to be realistic and say there's a momentum for change. Getting that over the line, I think, is going to need us all to work together. And I think the alcohol and drug sector and public health to work together. And I think actually perhaps not be divided in the way in which I think we probably still are a little bit, kind of the either or I was referring to. So I think we need to be realistic. Some of the things are not going to be easy. I'm sure there's going to be kind of public reactions, but I think picking up on some of what David's doing, we need to be asking, well, David's comment really, we need to be asking ourselves, is it ethical not to be considering this? And I think that's actually a really strong argument. So, no, I don't think we're suddenly going to be able to roll out all the things that I'm talking about, but I think there's certainly, we need to be able to move towards them.
So, I mean, I when I started in this gig, I was kind of very naive, and I assumed that the strength of my argument in the science would be enough to persuade anyone that we should do it. And of course, now I know that that's not the case. I would preface my comments to say that we come from slightly different places. The business of needle exchange, I think, was established quickly because non-needle using people were scared of what might happen if these terrible, terrible things spread further afield. And so it had huge support from a wider community. It was self-serving. Whereas within the music festival environment, pill testing was established by pill testers, for pill testers, so they could stay safe while they consumed their drugs. And so there hasn't been that huge buy-in in the first instance when this evolved. What has changed in that space is that more and more, apparently, straight folk are using drugs. The kids of important people use drugs. And all this comes down to self-serving, keeping your children alive as opposed to other people's children alive. And what has changed, I think, in Australia, it's been very interesting to watch as an outsider, is that the reluctance of academia to engage in this debate has created a vacuum which has now been occupied by advocacy groups. So if you look at what happened in the medical cannabis space, that wasn't driven by government, that wasn't driven by academics, that was driven almost uniquely by a lady called Lucy Haslam, whose son died of a terrible type of cancer. And this is also what is happening in a lot of drugs policy. We see there's a larger crossbench in the Australian Parliament, particularly the Senate, than we've ever seen before. And this is because of disillusionment in politics in Australia. People look at things like refugee policy, like climate change, like drugs policy, and they go, no, you're not representing what I stand for. And so they're going to the alternative. And I think it will be the alternative that drives through drugs policy reform in Australia. And so that's why it's really important to engage with the public, to engage with social media, to engage with advocacy groups, because in the end, they're going to put the bad guys out of a job.
Thank you, Ross. Fred MacDonald. To Kathryn, with your 20 needle exchange points around the country, does a person have to register when they come in? Because we've got, the natural paranoia of a user. Does it act as a barrier if they have to register to them not coming?
It's confidential. It's anonymous.
You don't have to register to
He's nipped off to make some phone calls.
We've got journalist alert.
Oh. Thanks for giving away my cover. I was going to say something like I work for the homeless shelter. So just two quick questions about the actual drug testing on site. On that graph, there was a relatively, in fact, I think the highest bar showed ask around.
Yep.
What does that even mean? How do you know that they're not going to ask and their friends are going to be like, take it, and then that actually bumps up the other graph?
The highest bar has been the pill.
Right.
So, but you're right. There are other things. Oh, do you want me to?
Yes.
Yeah. So the highest bar has in fact been the pill.
Over time.
Even over time. Yeah. Let's remember who goes to music festivals. They're not your folks, sir. They're your folk. That's right. They're cashed up. And it ain't cheap to go to a music festival these days. I don't know what it is in New Zealand. It's $200-300 for a weekend. And they do not want to end up in hospital. They want to see Tiesto on the final night or whoever the hell it is. And if it means, screw it, bad luck, that's what it is. They are happy to trash that. And that, the assumption that people won't bin their pills is an assumption made by people who are too dated to know who the people going to music festivals are. They will bin their pills. They will ask around this. So they'll ask their mates and say, did you get the same result? Was this what you got as well? And if there's a consistency within that peer group about what the findings are with regards to that pill, or maybe somebody has used that pill. But what it does is it gives that opportunity to pause. It's creating a little bit of insecurity. And if I can do that, that's better than just letting them hack on themselves. So I'll have that. of that, people who ask around, there will be a significant group of them who will then go on to bin the pill. Some of them will probably take the pill as well. They'll give it a kick. But I've caused a little bit of indecision in a teachable moment. So, and your second question.
When you're testing the pill, how much of it are you testing? Do you get people who are like, oh, well, if you're going to test half my pill, I don't want to test it. It's going to waste my...
Oh, when was the last time you went to a festival, hon? When do you take one serious? Okay. Yeah. Well, actually, I don't know anybody using drugs at a festival. And I've been in this scene for 15 years, who rock up with one pill. Of course they can. Yeah, not that often. So people are frequently happy to sacrifice a half. We can test a scraping. The important, from a legal perspective, is we never give back that which has been given to us. That could constitute supply. So it's one-way traffic. Whatever you choose to give us. What we tell them is that we can get far better information about, the more you give us, the better an analysis we can give you. If you've got, say, for example, a product that's heterogeneous, that's not mixed well, we can be certain that if you give us the full product, we can be certain of what's throughout the whole thing. So the more you give us, the better, the less harm we can promise you will come to.
Final question to another journalist.
Just for Kathryn, John from the Dominion Post. You're talking about the ability to wipe out hepatitis C. Could you just explain that a little bit more, how we might actually be able to achieve that in New Zealand?
Great question.
Okay, so we now have the Pharmac have rolled out and provided treatment for hepatitis C. So I think I was at a presentation the other week where one of the doctors up in Auckland was saying we have the potential by 2030 to eliminate hepatitis C. So it's about identifying those, many of whom may well be injecting drug users who don't yet know that they're HCV positive. And once we have that tested, accessing treatment and making sure that they can get the treatment and the treatment's improved. So we're actually seeing now quite significant positive experiences of the treatment. Previously it wasn't particularly good for people, but it has improved and it's made significant difference for people. So part of it's the part of it's testing, part of it's about accessing treatment, and then of course if we have we've got the continued work around the needle exchange, around messages around not sharing, etc., then we can't get the virus kind of ongoingly transmitted. I have to say that's probably an aspirational goal because we actually need to get hold of everybody, and that's going to be a big issue. And the level of treatments that we're going to need at the moment, we don't have probably access to enough. In fact, there's some work kind of being done overseas about that. But it's a rapidly changing arena. In fact, there are kind of two big international conferences that are going off in the next month looking at what best practice is around helping injecting drug users access services around hepatitis C. But I mean, bottom line is now, it used to be, like with HIV, we've seen massive changes now. It used to be a cause of death, but actually now it's treatable and preventable. Yeah.
I think there was a final. Eugene.
Oh, kia ora, I'm Eugene Ryder. I do drug testing within one of the gangs in the city here. And afraid of you, sir. And I'm not with the police guy. And I was concerned about the accuracy and the fact that we're testing for specific things and we may not be picking up other things, and just wondering, because what we do comes at a cost, and there are chapters around the country that are interested, but they got to sell a tinny to buy a drug test. So it's kind of, so yeah, there's a couple of kind of questions in there. One would probably be at Ross around whether it can or can't be subsidised. But yeah, looking for stuff that we don't know exists is it's hard to comprehend. And a question for Kathryn is, do they plan on introducing needle exchanges within the prison system? So.
Great questions.
Well, I have to say that providing drug checking services in the gang environment is something that had never been proposed to me. And I'm both terrified and excited by the prospect. Once again, different demographic, fascinating to find out what's out there. And I would have thought that would be, you'd be bananas not to include that in an early warning system. There are little patches of ground in any society where different types of drugs, different ways of using drugs, it's tribal almost. And we need to know about all of these tribes. And within a gang environment, I know what it would be in Australia. It would be largely methamphetamine. I'm not sure what it would be in New Zealand. I think it would be fascinating. Perhaps even more interesting is the opportunity to use this as a way of engaging people. Because I know, certainly, it's probably the same with you, as it is. It's a very refractory group. It's even more refractory than the dance music group. There are, the dance music folk are pretty open to chat about things. As if there's any suggestion of gangs or criminality, they're shut down to me, or have been, without a lot of groundwork. To use this as an opening up ploy for a dialogue with consumers about maybe changing the way they use drugs, that would be awesome. So, the actual cost of the kit that we're talking about, all up, full up, is you could probably get it for about $40,000. But then that runs, and everybody goes, oh, my sweet Jesus. In the world of medical grants, we'd probably have to buy 3 of them to make people even look at it as a project. So in medical financing, that ain't nothing. And there are very few consumables. So once you got it, you got it. And you can shake it, and it doesn't rattle. It's it's pretty robust. I'm not sure how to go on the back of a Harley, but I'm prepared to write a paper on it. So.
Last word.
Oh, the last word. Good question. I think needle exchanges in prisons do exist in the world. There's a couple of challenges always around needle exchange in prisons. There's a kind of the prison system itself, first of all, has to acknowledge that if they're putting needle and syringes in prisons, that there is drug use in prisons, which, given it's supposed to be a secure environment, is a bit of a kind of contradiction in terms. So there's always that challenge to overcome. There's often cited prison security and risk of injury and weapons. Well, there's no evidence that that's particularly happening either. So we do know that needle exchanges in prisons work. They're a valuable form of harm reduction. Interestingly, we also know from New Zealand studies that a correlation between hepatitis C positive is that you've been in prison. So that tells me it's either injecting drug use or tattooing in the jail. So there's obviously something going off in the jail. So certainly I think that's on our agenda around having conversations with corrections as to what their approach is. Has to be said that corrections AOD strategy has historically been very abstinence treatment-based focused with therapeutic communities, which I was involved in running at KNZ. But actually in recent years they've started to broaden the work that they're doing. So I think we're some way off, but I think there's certainly a conversation to be had there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kathryn. Well, I'm going to I'll just bring us to a close now. I'm just checking my diary to see when the next one is. Sorry. Poorly organised. 23rd. So can I thank you all for coming and joining in what is a very important topic, both how we expand already well operating harm reduction services and how we grow services for a new market. Next month, on the 23rd of September, we're talking about law enforcement, and actually can we change up the way that law enforcement works. So there's we're trying to create a picture here that there's a lot of things that New Zealand could be doing better from a very staunchly harm reduction focus, which again is sort of the key principle underpinning our new national drug policy. I'll end it now. Thank you very much for coming, and please stick around. We'll carry the conversation on out there. And to those folks online, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.